I'm a beta, my childhood sweetheart, an alpha, and I have been in love and living together for 7 years. We were about to get married. But on the eve of our wedding, my fiancé came clean. I love you, but I can't help being drawn to other omegas. Then he brought one of them home to the house we shared. Felix and I were childhood sweethearts, and our families were a good match. We were always respectful of each other. We got together partly because of our complicated family business ties, and partly because of love. But that love has soured. We haven't shared a bed in 2 years. He's often not home, or he comes back so late he tells the housekeeper not to wake me and just sleeps in the guest room. I think he has someone else. I tried my best to keep up the appearance of harmony, to just look the other way. But he didn't want to hide it anymore. A week before the wedding, he laid it all on the table. He said he still wanted to marry me. He even said he still loved me, but that he was like a dying tree, inevitably drawn to the reign of a young omega. He suggested I go out and meet new people too, to get from someone else what he couldn't give me anymore. Of course, I refused. He told me he wasn't asking for my opinion, he was just informing me. And then, he had the nerve to bring his lover into our home. His dark eyes were hazy, like a midnight fog. He had long lashes like seaweed, lips like flower petals, and slender, pale fingers like freshly peeled bamboo shoots. The moment I saw him, I felt something shift and break beneath my skin. Felix told me his name was Jackson. When he introduced the omega, it was like he was showing off a prized possession he'd cherished for years. He gazed at Jackson with a look of obsession and satisfaction, even a hint of pride in owning such a treasure. It broke my heart. Jackson was incredibly docile. He was so well cared for that he had nothing to do. He spoke when Felix told him to speak, and if Felix told him to sit somewhere, he'd sit there without moving. My attitude was hardly friendly, but my upbringing kept me from embarrassing him. After Jackson left, I made Felix stay behind. You should have broken up with me before moving Jackson in here. I told him I wanted to break up. Jackson's not moving in. I got him a luxury apartment, Felix said with a careless smile. And I'm not breaking up with you. No one can ever replace you. Besides, have you forgotten? This is a business arrangement. We don't get to call the shots. If something goes wrong, it'll be bad for everyone. On Valentine's Day, Felix booked the best restaurant and hotel in the city to spend the entire day with Jackson. Thinking he was being transparent with me, he casually asked for my advice on what kind of gifts were popular these days. I kept my emotions in check and my dignity intact, but I had no intention of helping him with his absurd plans. He felt no remorse. As he was leaving, he sincerely suggested I go have fun at a party our friends were throwing. Felix was cruel. He ignored my wishes, certain I would put the big picture first and never leave him. I guess he's the one who molded me into this person, step by step. First, it was a perfume I didn't recognize. Then lipstick stains, strands of hair, flirty texts, intimate photos, hickeys. In the beginning, he'd make up serious excuses. Later, if I brought it up, he'd just smile, which was as good as an admission. After countless rounds of self-doubt, of breaking down and putting myself back together, I thought I'd finally given up on my fantasies and accepted he had his secrets. But now, he couldn't even be bothered to hide it. I was exhausted. I had my driver take me to my lawyer's office. Felix and I were supposed to be a perfect match. We had a deep connection, and the business ties between our families were a complex, tangled web. Everyone assumed we would get married. I used to think so, too. Because of that, we had a lot of jointly owned properties and businesses we ran together. Our lives were completely intertwined. Now, I was determined to draw a clear line. I didn't want any financial ties to him, so I hired a lawyer to draft a separation agreement. I signed my name on the retainer stroke by stroke. Evan. I had been lost for too long. It was time to find myself again. As I left the law firm, I noticed a gift and a bouquet of preserved flowers, already wrapped, under the lawyer's desk. My lawyer had Valentine's Day plans, too. I was the only one left behind. How did it come to this? Had I lost my charm? Plagued by self-doubt, I went to my friend's party. The party was at his beach house. When my friend led me in, all I saw were board shorts and ruffled bikinis. completely out of season. Tan thighs, V-lines, and a tangle of youthful limbs spilling out of the heated pool. Countless naked stares landed on me. I felt like a piece of meat on a grill, with everyone judging my cut, my aging, and what kind of aroma I'd give off once they added seasoning. I'm just a beta. The gazes quickly moved on. He was in good shape. Cheap jeans hugged his powerful thighs, and a simple white t-shirt couldn't hide his broad shoulders and narrow waist. He wasn't in the water. He just stood in a corner with his hands in his pockets, leaning against the wall. He watched the laughing crowd with a searching, curious expression, like a stag that had wandered into a city nightclub. I watched him, and our eyes met across the room. After a few seconds, he walked through the crowd toward me. He said his name was Calvin. He asked if I was with anyone. If not, would I consider spending the day with him? His advance was direct and intense, but I instinctively turned him down. My friend told me not to be wasteful and gave Calvin my number anyway. I only stayed at the party for half an hour. After I got home, I received a message from Calvin asking me out. I thought about it, then sent Calvin's number to a private investigator. The PI sent me his background check in no time. I'm used to having control, staying within my comfort zone. I spent a long time in the bathroom. I sat in the tub, touching my own body. It was soft, clean, barren, and thin. My fingers sank into my flesh, leaving indentations, a sign of a strengthless sort of emptiness. I went on the date. Calvin took me to a high-end steakhouse. He'd slicked his hair back and worn a suit. He'd obviously made an effort to dress up to meet me at a place he didn't frequent. As we talked, he would unconsciously tug at his collar to ease the discomfort of the formal wear, but he pulled out my chair for me, asked about my preferences and allergies, and carried himself like a true gentleman. This restaurant was notoriously hard to get a reservation at, which is why Calvin chose it for our date. But I was a Black Card member there. I knew the price behind every dish the waiter brought me. It wasn't a sum he could easily afford. I looked into his eyes. They were deep and clear, like mountain springs, like lakes, like the Milky Way, like a pair of blue-gray gems that refracted light into dreams. Are you mixed? At my question, Calvin lowered his eyes. My mother is Finnish. He had a Western bone structure wrapped in the soft features unique to East Asians. His eyebrows were thick and defined, his lashes long, but his skin was so fine I couldn't see a single pore. I couldn't help but think of that Omega Jackson. I felt that he, like Jackson, was born to be loved, a masterpiece sculpted by gods, a flower nurtured by demons. I couldn't deny his appeal. In that moment, I felt like I finally understood Felix. I looked down and started cutting my steak. I saw my own hands. They were well manicured but too thin. I could see the blue veins beneath the pale skin. I could see what I had lost in those hands. Not just time, but the love that once filled me to bursting. Why are you pursuing me? I don't know. I saw you across the room, and you were all I could see. Maybe you looked like a piece of art that didn't belong in that loud, tacky party. You were beautiful, elegant, but you also seemed to be covered in cracks. I stopped cutting my steak, my appetite gone. I hadn't wanted to eat anyway. I put down my fork and met Calvin's gaze. I want to do something for you, Calvin said, looking at me with undisguised adoration. I turned to look out the window. Coincidentally, I saw Jackson and Felix through the glass. It was still cold for February. Jackson was wearing a silver-gray fur coat, his small face buried in the soft fur, holding an ice cream cone with both hands. Felix, worried he'd get cold, wrapped his own overcoat around him, cupped Jackson's hands in his, and blew warm air on them. So tender, so affectionate. They looked like a match made in heaven. I thought I would feel a pang of pain, but when I spoke, my voice was light. See that couple hugging outside? The one on the left is my fiancé. Calvin's expression froze. I turned back to him, thinking of his passionate gaze, of how Felix used to look at me with that same fire, of the perfect couple just outside the window. I wanted to laugh, but all I could do was let out a heavy sigh. But he'll be my ex-fiancé soon. I took a key card out of my pocket and placed it on the table. Calvin hadn't gotten a room, but I had. The card was trimmed in gold with a tiny diamond in the corner, signifying the presidential suite on the top floor. Calvin stared at the card, and I could see understanding dawn on his face. There was no surprise, no anger. He just stood up. I didn't know. He kept his composure, but his body shifted slightly toward the restaurant's exit. I knew he wanted to leave. I discreetly lowered my eyes, hiding my disappointment and shame. He didn't say anything else. After a moment of silence, I heard footsteps. A pair of simple leather shoes appeared in my line of sight. I didn't even have to look up. Calvin knelt before me, taking my hand in his and looking up at me. You're so clever. One look at that expression, and I can't say no to you. I blinked in surprise. He stood up, picked up the card, and took my hand, pulling me out of my seat. He led me quickly out of the restaurant. I could see the broad strength of his back and the straight line of his neck. I stumbled a little trying to keep up. He pulled me into an elevator, and as soon as the doors closed, he turned around and cupped my face with his calloused hands. Is this revenge? Cheating on him? No. He leaned down and kissed me. His lips were hot and well-defined. Kissing him felt like being swept into a storm, losing all sense of myself. It was like being caught in a flood. I clung to his shoulders like he was the only piece of driftwood in the water. I was a wave, crashing violently, only to dissolve into disillusioned foam on an endless shore. The first light of dawn was breaking as I woke up in Calvin's arms. He was holding me from behind, nuzzling me affectionately. I reached back and stroked his hair. I thought you would leave. Is that what you wanted? No. I turned to face him, cupping his cheeks. I looked at his messy hair, the light stubble on his face, and his young, intense, and slightly sleepy eyes. I felt like I was transported back 7 years, struck by a sense of how much had changed. Stay a little longer. I closed my eyes and offered him my lips. I thought I would run into Felix when I got home, but it turned out he and Jackson were having such a good time they'd flown to Europe on a whim. To show how considerate he was, he had the housekeeper give me a bouquet of flowers and a gift. I took the lilies from the housekeeper, found a vase for them, and opened the gift box. Inside was a new custom bag from some luxury brand. I tossed it to the housekeeper and asked him to put it in my closet. The housekeeper looked at me, then hesitated before speaking. Sir, did you have a pleasant evening? He'd known me since I was a child. When Felix and I moved in together, I brought him with us. He cared about me deeply, so I didn't mind him overstepping. I touched my neck, where there was probably a hickey or two. Is it obvious? The housekeeper shook his head. You look well. That's a relief. Hearing his words, I looked up at him. His eyes were kind and warm. I suddenly realized that during this long, lonely period, I had unknowingly become numb just to cope with the humiliation. I was oblivious to my own pain and had lost my sensitivity to kindness. Now, seeing his gentle concern, a bitter sorrow flooded every crack in my soul. My eyes reddened. I smiled at him, then turned and went upstairs. I put Calvin out of my mind. I had to get back to my life. I didn't want to pin my happiness on 1 or 2 men. I drew a strict, safe line for myself. Calvin texted to ask if I'd gotten home safely. I didn't reply. He called and I didn't answer. He took the hint and stopped trying to contact me. One Wednesday, I had plans with the police chief's wife. A mutual friend of ours had opened an art gallery, and we'd agreed to go show our support. The chief's wife sent a row of massive, extravagant floral arrangements. I just had a few paintings delivered. Our friend acted equally delighted with both gifts, but as we walked, he only took my arm. He showed me the paintings in his gallery. Most were by up-and-coming artists, with a few pieces by masters, but not many caught my eye. They were all just paintings, all the same in a way, either wild or serene, grand or vibrant, all neatly confined within their frames. As I walked, I felt nothing. I was about to buy a couple of pieces just to make our friend happy when the chief's wife suddenly asked, "What perfume are you wearing today?" Perfume? Oh, could it be pheromones? But you're a beta. I stopped and sniffed my wrist. Our mutual friend leaned in to smell my neck. He and the chief's wife were both omegas, so they were sensitive to pheromones. Our friend said with certainty, "It's cedar, and it's soaked in deep." The chief's wife laughed. "I heard your fiancé is off traveling with another Omega. I was worried you two were having problems, but it looks like those were just rumors. Our parents were pushing for my marriage to Felix, and I hadn't told them anything yet. I wasn't going to reveal what was happening until I had made a clean break from him." The chief's wife's smile vanished, and she feigned confusion. "But isn't Felix's scent brandy?" The air between us instantly chilled. My friend, whose arm I was holding, flinched and almost pulled away, but he stopped himself and just said awkwardly, "What are you talking about?" "I'm wearing a cedar-scented perfume," I replied calmly. "It's a new, unreleased line from a perfumery I just acquired. There are 12 scents in total called Scented Boyfriend. They perfectly mimic pheromones. If you're interested, I can send you a couple of sets." The chief's wife's face stiffened. "Oh, I see." I smiled. They laughed along with me. Suddenly, I was bored with this whole charade. I pulled away from them and walked ahead. A painting in the corner caught my eye. It was of a garden, with a boy sitting barefoot on the grass, seemingly pulling a thorn from his toe where a rose had pricked him. But his eyes were fixed on a fairy in the garden. The fairy was white and naked, like a shattered porcelain doll, with rose thorns and roots trailing from its cracks. I saw the signature and the date on the painting, and I stopped smiling. I glanced down at my watch and then showed it to my friends. "Just kidding. I do have a new boyfriend. I have to go meet him now. See you later." I waved goodbye, leaving them standing there with stunned expressions, and walked out of the gallery. I had my driver take me to Calvin's studio, which was right next to his university campus. We drove the conspicuous luxury car into a shabby alley near the school, and I, in my expensive clothes, climbed the dark, damp stairs. I knocked on a wooden door with peeling paint. Calvin appeared, sleeves rolled up, wearing a work apron, and splattered with paint. He saw me and looked completely shocked. I noticed a white plastic string tied across the doorway, with a cardboard sign that read, "Working. Do not disturb." I stepped over the line, pushed Calvin to the ground, and closed the door. The studio was empty. I'm not supposed to be affected by pheromones, but at that moment, it was as if I could smell the rich scent of cedar. A thrill shot through me, starting from my toes. Calvin was afraid to touch me. I took his hands and placed them on my face. So Calvin was a painter. I touched the paint with my warm fingers. The blues, reds, and greens seemed to breathe life back into my soul. My chest was in turmoil, yet it felt like something new was sprouting from deep within. I devoured, I drained, I depended on his young, vibrant love. Calvin kissed me. "Why did you come here?" I asked him, "Do you want to have a gallery show?" "Yes." "And you need to paint a lot for that, right?" "Yes." "Do you need a model?" He held my sweaty back tightly, pressing a reverent kiss to my flushed earlobe. "You are my muse." I stayed with Calvin for 3 days and 2 nights. When I went home, I was wearing Calvin's t-shirt and jeans. He was much bigger than me. I had to fold over the waistband of the jeans and buckle the belt on the tightest hole to keep them from sliding off my hips. I walked in carrying a painting Calvin had done for me and looked up to see Felix sitting in the living room. He clearly hadn't seen me like this in a long time and looked surprised. I instinctively touched my collarbone, where Calvin had left a bite mark. "They said you got a new boyfriend. Looks like it's true. Is your trip over?" I placed the painting on a display cabinet in the living room and stepped back to admire it, ignoring Felix's stare. Felix came up behind me and looked at the painting with me. "He painted this?" "Yes. It's really good." I rarely paid much attention to my own appearance. I was too familiar with it and perhaps too disappointed. In the painting, I was reclining on a sofa, nude, on top of a canvas. My long neck was tilted back into a feathered pillow. My hands, bony but elegant, rested lightly on my stomach and thigh. My legs were crossed, my posture open and serene. He had painted me beautifully. My curved lashes, my Cupid's bow, the delicate tip of my nose, all of it was beautiful. The emotion shining from the corners of my long eyes was beautiful. He loved me, and so, from a cracked porcelain vase, I had grown roots. I had bloomed. I turned and thanked Felix. Thank you. His expression froze for a second at my smile. For what? For giving me the chance to meet him. Felix's Adam's apple bobbed. He pursed his lips and smiled at me. Can I choose my own thank you gift? I nodded. Sure. He reached out, scooped me up by the waist, and lifted me into his arms. I was caught off guard, a little stunned. I looked up and saw his determined jawline. I understood, and yet I didn't. Why now? After 2 years of not touching me, why was he suddenly curious again? Then it hit me. Maybe he was just reminding me that he could still control me. He laid me down on the bed and loosened his tie. There was a dark fire in his eyes. With a strange clarity, I decided to watch and see what he would do, observing him openly. He was the epitome of an alpha. He was more handsome than most, with features that seemed to concentrate all the best traits of his bloodline. He was proud, poised, and radiant, like a golden peacock. When he wanted to be, he could switch seamlessly between charmingly roguish and regally aloof. He was rebellious in his youth and grew more stable with maturity. Of course, I had loved him. The stars had aligned for us, so we got together. Even as he slowly broke me, all I wanted was to carefully cut him out of my life. Felix leaned over me, his hands braced on either side of my pillow. You're a little distracted, he said in a husky voice. Ah, sorry. Being so close, he saw the bite mark Calvin had left on my neck. His fingertips traced the swollen, broken skin, sending shivers through me. His expression was unreadable, as if he were studying another painting. Looks like you had a good few days. You like him a lot? I admitted it. Yes. Felix frowned. Because he's a painter? Yes. My family made me major in business management in college. I originally wanted to go to art school. Does he know we're getting married? I smirked but didn't answer. You might want to pick someone else. It's obvious he's possessive. He's left a deep mark on you. Felix's tone was flat as he pressed his thumb harder against my neck, as if trying to rub the mark away. I can't smell it, but pheromones don't lie. You're a beta. He's put a lot of effort into wrapping his scent around you. Maybe it's subconscious, but he clearly wants to drive off anyone else. My body tensed. I remembered how, in our passion, Calvin's brow would furrow in frustration. At the time, I thought he was lost in desire and reached up to smooth his forehead. He had grabbed my hand, tightening his grip as he kissed my palm. Just as I raised my hands to push Felix off me, his phone rang. The ringtone was obviously one he'd set just for Jackson. Without hesitation, Felix got up and answered the call. I don't know what was said, but his face changed. He hung up and started for the door. I asked, though I already knew the answer, who was that? Felix didn't hide it. Jackson's heat started. I have to go right now, or he'll find someone else. I found it absurd. You haven't marked him? Felix laughed. I don't know how long my feelings for him will last, and neither does he. I'm self-aware enough to know that. This was unexpected. I thought Jackson was Felix's true love, but it seemed he was just another affair. I sighed. Let's break up. Just be with Jackson. Felix paused at the door, looking annoyed. I already told you you're irreplaceable. Why are you jealous of him? Once his heat is over, I'll come back and explain everything properly. He still left me, tossing a casual "I'll explain later" over his shoulder as he walked out. And somehow I felt relieved. I moved out of the house I shared with Felix, taking my housekeeper with me back to my own villa. I let myself go, seeing Calvin constantly. I cut back on social gatherings and started showing up on the university campus in shorts and sweatshirts. I would hang out in Calvin's studio, drinking bubble tea and eating burgers, wearing nothing but the paint he'd smeared on me. I would also take Calvin to fancy restaurants, get him custom-made clothes from designers I knew, and bring him to art salons to introduce him to famous names in the industry. At night, we'd hold each other in the villa's pool. Calvin never refused me. He seemed to take all my gestures in stride, but when our limbs were tangled together, he would cautiously press his nose to my neck, inhaling my scent. His limbs tightening around me as if trying to merge my ribs with his own, to absorb me into his body. Sometimes I felt guilty. I couldn't give Calvin a clear definition of our relationship. Felix had left me drained, exhausted, and full of defenses. More than once, I told Calvin he could leave me at any time. They say love at first sight is your genes making their most honest choice. It means I'm loving you on instinct. Every cell in my body craves you. I fall for you more every second of every day. If I could leave, I would have left a long time ago. So please don't say something so cruel. Just hold on to me, as if you love me, too. His words were like a spell. I lost all resistance. I fell deeper and deeper. Then I received a letter. I grabbed 2 bottles of red wine from my wine cellar. As I was heading out, I was surprised to see Felix. He was standing at my door, asking with confusion, "You moved back?" I was shocked. I couldn't believe he'd been living at Jackson's for weeks without even checking our old place. But it didn't matter anymore. I reminded him firmly we broke up. My fault. I came back too late, Felix said, offering a rare apology. Come home with me. Feels weird not seeing you there. He was actually here to take me back. I couldn't fathom his logic. I have plans, I said, unwilling to get dragged into this again. Felix looked at the bag in my hand, his expression complicated. You're going to cook for him? Yes. I haven't had your cooking in a long time. I glanced down at the plastic bag. The prosciutto, truffles, and caviar were all things Felix was sick of. In the past, he wouldn't have even glanced at them if I'd served them. Let Jackson cook for you. You don't like this stuff. Felix just stared at me. I could see he was a little hurt. But what was his little bit of hurt compared to all the years of pain I'd felt? He reached for my hand, but I pulled it behind my back. Felix still didn't understand the situation between us. He reluctantly withdrew his hand. Most of my heart is still yours. I couldn't be bothered to respond. I'll come back when you've cooled down. He left. I went to the garage, put the groceries in the trunk of a modest-looking car, and got into the driver's seat myself. Being with Calvin made me feel alive again. I wanted to do everything for him myself. I didn't even want a driver anymore. I drove to the studio and opened the door to find Calvin wasn't there. I figured he'd be back soon, so I waited on the sofa and ended up falling asleep. When I woke up, the studio was still empty. I called Calvin. He answered, but he was rushed. He said his professor had dragged him to an art-related gala and he couldn't get away. I was a bit disappointed, but I asked for the address of the event. I put the groceries in the small fridge I'd bought for the studio and drove over. I needed an invitation to get in, so I called the organizer, who came out to greet me with a big smile. I was dressed simply and walked through the glamorous crowd with ease. I was so tired of these flashy, superficial events. I ignored the stares, feeling more relaxed than I had in a long time. I spotted Calvin's awkward figure in a corner of the ballroom. He hadn't had time to change and was standing with a short, thin, white-haired man among a group of well-dressed, pot-bellied art dealers. He seemed to be trying not to offend his professor, forcing a smile, but his cheekbones and shoulders were unnaturally stiff. Just as I was about to walk over, someone tapped my shoulder. I turned around and, to my surprise, saw Felix. What are you doing here? He was in a suit, his hair slicked back, wearing a pair of gold-rimmed glasses. He looked as dapper, arrogant, and deceptively charming as ever. Jackson, dressed exquisitely, was on his arm, looking at me thoughtfully. Behind him stood another tall, handsome man who looked at me with a flash of surprise and admiration. And who is this? The man asked. Felix answered for him, my husband. He said it so naturally. Jackson lowered his eyes and looked away. The handsome man's expression instantly froze, clearly embarrassed by the situation. Felix smiled and pulled me closer, holding me against his chest. Don't worry about it. We have an arrangement. We see other people. If you want to pursue him, I don't mind. The man was speechless, his eyes darting between me and Felix. He let out an audible hiss. I frowned and pushed Felix's hand off my shoulder. I glanced back toward Calvin, who still hadn't seen me. Today was a special day for me, and I didn't want Felix to ruin his mood. I gave up on approaching him and grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. Right in front of Felix, I invited the handsome stranger to join me for some fresh air in the garden. The man was flattered but hesitant, glancing at Felix a few times. I took the first step and he eventually followed. I looked back to see Felix standing there, his expression unreadable. I found a quiet bench in the garden and sat down. Once I was settled, I noticed several other couples meeting secretly nearby. I felt a wave of melancholy. The handsome stranger hesitated about sitting next to me. I patted the bench and he sat down. We clinked glasses, drank champagne, and chatted. He was, as expected, the young heir of some wealthy family, just back from studying abroad. He sighed. I didn't realize the social scene here was just as messy as it is overseas. I laughed out loud. He quickly tried to backtrack. I didn't mean you're messy. You seem very nice. I was very nice. I was an only child and a beta. So much of my life was out of my control. I had a wild jungle inside me, but I had to prune it into the shape of a manicured garden. I was bound by my responsibilities. I was well-mannered, like a beautiful, untouchable flower on a high mountain, devoid of life. So when I learned that the arrogant, wild, and radiant Felix was my arranged partner, I was immensely grateful and threw myself into loving him without a second thought. But in the end, an arrangement is an arrangement. Felix was always going to be Felix. I had to face the reality of our relationship and bear the consequences of my choice. For the handsome stranger, it was just a passing comment, but my mind had already raced through years of my life. I leaned my head back against the bench, my long neck looking pale and fragile in the moonlight. He said, "You have an arrangement. Is that true? How old are you?" 21. A young peacock. I knew what he was asking. He reminded me a bit of a younger Felix, maybe a little more frivolous, a little less confident. But he was handsome and probably used to charming his way through life, knowing just how to use his appeal. My first instinct was to say I already had a boyfriend, but then I thought, how ridiculous. I had never defined my relationship with Calvin. In this seemingly open situation, what difference did it make if I had 2 men or 3 or 4? The cool breeze made me feel lazy and open. The handsome stranger leaned in, as if to kiss me. My body was more honest than my mind. The instant his lips came close, I put my hand up to block him. He froze. "I'm sorry," I said, suddenly standing up and running back toward the ballroom. I had to find Calvin. I finally understood. I accepted Calvin simply because he was Calvin. I was panicking. I needed to see Calvin. I needed to confirm. I ran right into someone's chest. I looked up and saw Felix. He had been standing nearby watching me the whole time. He saw the panic on my face. He instinctively grabbed my wrist, and I instinctively tried to pull away. "Let go of me. Don't go in there." Felix trapped me in his arms, squeezing so tight my bones creaked. His expression was complicated, but he just patted my back, trying to calm me down. "Don't go in." An alpha just went into a rut. It's really dangerous. You can't smell it, but the ballroom is full of a pungent pheromone scent. I froze. What scent? Cedar. I suddenly noticed Jackson was no longer by Felix's side. My blood ran cold. I used all my strength to throw off Felix's hand, even stomping hard on his foot, and rushed into the ballroom. The room was half empty. I saw a dark mass rolling on the floor. Security guards with riot poles tried to restrain the person, but he bent the metal with one hand. Looking closer, I saw it was 2 people tangled together, Calvin and Jackson. Calvin was drenched in sweat, veins popping on his forehead, desperately clinging to Jackson's clothes. Jackson was half draped over him, likely induced into heat by the pheromones. Even his neck was flushed a deep pink, like a wilted flower, crumpled and soaked. I heard a guard, pinching his nose, say, "These pheromones are insane." I heard another guard say, "Hurry, separate them." I remembered Calvin saying he loved me out of instinct, that my pull on him was genetic. I believed him, but what could be stronger than an omega's pull on an alpha, or an alpha's instinctual craving for an omega? Suddenly, my vision blurred with tears. I love him. The moment I confirmed it, I shattered. In my long years of dryness, I had developed countless cracks. I could still hold myself together, But now I was broken. I heard a crisp snap in my chest. It broke into countless tiny, sharp fragments that pierced my organs, traveling with my heavy heartbeat into every vein until even my fingertips throbbed with pain. I covered my eyes, and tears streamed through my fingers. Then the guard said, "Wait. No, he's pushing the Omega away." The other guard, "Ah, he's coming this way." I was enveloped in a sweaty embrace. I knew the heat of that body. I knew who was holding me, and I felt safe. Couldn't lift my head. I just sobbed. Felix rushed in after me, covering his nose, and saw Calvin holding me tightly in his arms. I have no scent, but he buried his face in my neck, breathing me in greedily. "I'm sorry. I can't control it. I'm sorry." Calvin struggled to form words. "Can I take you away? I want to take you away. Can I?" My answer was to wrap my arms around his neck. In front of everyone, Calvin lifted me into his arms. I could feel the restrained trembling beneath his iron-hard muscles. I didn't spare a single glance for Felix standing nearby. I just looked up and kissed Calvin, breathing softly in his ear. My car is on the left side of the parking lot. I had been through an Alpha's rut before, but I was still not used to Calvin's lack of control. I couldn't be like an Omega. Felt like a sacrifice. Calvin enveloped me like a dark cloud, like a dream woven from starlight and moonlight. I melted, I feared, I reveled. Our love intertwined. We stayed in the car for a long time. As night fell, Calvin slept on the back seat, as peaceful as a baby. I propped myself up, drove him back to the studio, kissed his restless eyelids, and wished him sweet dreams. I went home and ran a fever for 3 days. On the 4th day, Calvin was gone. I couldn't find him anywhere. It was like he had vanished into thin air. First came shock, then disappointment. I hired a PI, but they found nothing. I was frantic, and then I had to get used to it. Felix continued to stick by my side, refusing to give up. He took me to new parties where I met fresh new peacocks, but I couldn't distract myself. The old studio was still there. The floor still creaked when I stepped on it. The ink on the unfinished paintings was dry, the paint caked and peeling under my fingernails. A month later, I found the letter on the studio sofa. There was no name on it. I opened it and saw a photo. It was Jackson, his arm linked with Calvin's, his smile young and innocent as they stood closely together. My world spun. I went to see Jackson. He was waiting for me at a coffee shop. He looked worn out. The fresh, rain-like quality I had once admired was gone, replaced by a visible pain and gloom. He had dark circles under his eyes, his lips were chapped. His hair was as brittle as dry grass, and his clothes were thrown on haphazardly, with threads hanging loose. Clearly, he wasn't here to gloat. He was here to reveal a secret. He was tormented, and this secret seemed to be the only thing that could break the surface of his stagnant misery. Expecting the worst, I sat down across from him. As he began to tell his story in a quiet voice, I sat up straight, habitually maintaining my flawless composure and my precarious self-respect. As I slowly pieced together the truth, a cold fury washed over me, and at the same time, I felt like I was sinking into a swamp. Jackson's face spun and distorted in the mire. I saw his mouth opening and closing, but all I heard was the thick, popping sound of bubbles bursting in mud. Jackson and Calvin grew up in the same orphanage. They were childhood friends. Before any romance could blossom between them, Calvin discovered a life-changing art exhibition, and Jackson met a life-changing Felix. Calvin worked odd jobs to study painting and pursue his dream. Jackson was quickly captivated by Felix's charm and, knowing it was wrong, ended up in bed with him. Felix gave Jackson everything he wanted, materially. Calvin knew nothing about Jackson's situation and just thought of him as a friend who had suddenly struck it rich. A few months ago, Jackson got pregnant and told Felix. Felix seemed happy, told him to have the baby, and assured him he would take care of everything. A little while later, Felix brought him to meet me and announced our open arrangement. Unexpectedly, I hadn't given him a hard time. I scoffed. "I didn't know you were pregnant. This is absurd." Jackson sighed. "I know he didn't tell you, But as long as you accepted the arrangement and found other partners, he would have an excuse to convince you to accept the child. So, I couldn't finish the sentence. I could barely breathe. I suspected that Jackson had arranged for Calvin to seduce me, to speed up my fall. The words were like needles in my throat. I couldn't spit them out or swallow them. My chest felt frozen. Jackson looked at me and said earnestly, no, he had nothing to do with it. My body temperature shot back up, and my shoulders relaxed. I only then noticed I had dug several crescent-shaped marks into my palm with my own nails. Well, not entirely nothing. His face alone is enough to tempt anyone, but he's a simple, straightforward fool. I know him. You're his type. He just paints all day, so I told him he needed to meet people to find inspiration. I sent him to your friend's party. And look, Valentine's Day, the perfect time and place, he fell for you at first sight, just as I thought. When you had a PI investigate him, I intercepted the report and removed the parts about me. And then you two got together. When he loves someone, it pours out of him. I believe no one could resist him like that. I took a deep breath. So that's how it was. Jackson continued. Everything was going smoothly until that night he suddenly went into a rut and took me from the ballroom. Felix found out everything and was furious. He had Calvin tied up at a villa in the suburbs and beat him brutally in front of Jackson, telling him it was the price for his meddling. Felix told Calvin to make up an excuse and leave me. When Calvin refused, Felix had his men break Calvin's hands. Jackson, filled with regret for dragging the innocent Calvin into this mess, had a huge fight with Felix and was locked away. For the next few days, Jackson was left to fend for himself in the villa, forgotten by everyone. He finally managed to break a window and escape, intending to confront Felix. But outside Felix's company building, he saw Felix hugging another beautiful woman. He hadn't eaten in days, was starving and thirsty, and his clothes were torn. He looked like a mess. The woman saw him and laughed, calling him a beggar. Felix laughed along with her, saying he did look like one, the kind of delusional beggar who doesn't know their place. Jackson's expression was tragic. I got rid of the baby. I ignored his self-pity, tightening my grip on my coffee cup. Where is he? Jackson shook his head. I don't know. I reported it to the police, but it was useless. I don't feel sorry for you. You brought this on yourself. Yes. Everyone who makes a mistake pays a price. Jackson looked down, his eyes darting like a trapped animal in the night. He was once the docile Omega Felix had described. Perhaps he had planned all of this for the sake of his child, only to reap the bitter consequences. I'm leaving this place, Jackson said with a bitter smile. Maybe I never should have gotten involved in the first place. I went to Felix's company and stormed into his top-floor office. His secretary was sitting on his desk, hooking a finger around his tie, while he leaned in and whispered in her ear, a flirtatious smile on his face. When she saw me, the secretary scrambled off the desk, grabbed her heels, and scurried away. Felix just straightened his tie, his expression shifting back to the one I was used to seeing. What are you doing here? I looked at his face, perfect as a miracle, a face that was proud, cruel, and incredibly captivating. I used to love him so much. I was genuinely grateful that, out of all the flowers blooming for him, he had picked me, even if he only stayed for a moment before moving on. Felix's expression faltered. What are you talking about? I know everything. He's just some college kid. I yelled, you broke his hands. You threw him somewhere no one can find him. I could ignore all your other disgusting behavior, but I thought at the very least, you were a decent person. Felix yelled back. What was I supposed to do? Just stand by and watch you pour all your attention onto him? Watch him steal you away from me? I had never seen him so unhinged. Couldn't believe it. He seemed to have forgotten he was the one who suggested we see other people. He was acting like I was the betrayer. I asked him, weren't you the one who wanted to walk away from me without any strings attached? Felix denied it. That was a misunderstanding. You two almost had a child together. It's just a child. Playing around outside and bringing someone home are two different things. No one is more suitable for this position than you are. I won't ruin the life I have now. You'd better understand that, sooner rather than later. So your plan was to have me raise your illegitimate child? He would have been under your name. You're a beta. It's hard for you to have children anyway. Isn't it? Ha! I was completely disillusioned. I took the separation agreement my lawyer had prepared out of my bag and threw it on his desk. It was only a few sheets of paper, but they hit the desk with the heavy clang of sheet metal. Felix looked at the papers, then back at me, his composure finally cracking. All for that, Calvin? No, it's because the sight of you makes me sick. Felix snatched up the agreement and tore it to pieces without even looking at it. He threw the scraps aside, reached across the desk, and grabbed me by the collar, forcing me against him. He gritted his teeth. Have you forgotten that our relationship is fundamentally a business merger? You can't just do whatever you want. The moment we break up, a swarm of people will smell blood in the water. They'll dig up or invent countless negative stories, painting them in vivid detail. Our family's reputations will be destroyed, and all related business partnerships will suffer. You don't want to make things difficult for your family, do you? I've already announced to the media that I'm single again. If they're interested, they'll probably be here soon. So you'd better release who you need to release right now. Otherwise, I'll make this even uglier. I didn't back down an inch. His face twisted with rage. I saw the veins bulge on his forehead. He was frustrated, desperate, and furious. Throw your tantrum if you want. I'm not breaking up with you. No matter how big a scene you make, I'll find someone to bury it. You're insane. A knock on the door came at just the right moment. Felix let me go and told his secretary to come in. She informed us that a crowd of reporters had gathered downstairs. I gave him a cold smile. Felix took out his phone and made a video call. On the screen, I saw Calvin, hands tied and blindfolded, thrown in a dilapidated shack. Tears sprang to my eyes. I can let you keep watching him, or I can send him back to you piece by piece. You'd better think carefully about what you're going to say to those reporters. At this point, Felix had shed every last shred of decency. I realized how selfish he was. He only wanted to maintain his current life. He might have had feelings for me, but the only person he truly loved was himself. He would never, ever break up with me. He put his arm around me and led me downstairs to face the reporters. I put on a perfect smile and told them it was all a misunderstanding, that we were a happy couple and our relationship was stable. I kissed his cheek. My lips were ice cold. Malice seeped from my pores. I whispered in his ear, my tongue dripping venom.
I'm pregnant.
Felix's face changed. He couldn't show his anger in front of the reporters and just squeezed my waist tighter. If you dare touch him or this child, I will spend every single day of my life finding a way to take you down with me. I smiled sweetly. The reporters, thinking we were whispering endearments, sighed with envy. Felix held me steady as we posed for pictures, our cheeks pressed together. Are you really going to be this crazy? You like playing the fool so much, you might as well enjoy it. Felix released Calvin but had him confined to an orphanage abroad. In exchange, we got engaged. A few months later, the child was born. I gave the child my last name. When interviewed, Felix told the media he respected his partner's rights and had no objection. The baby and I lived in my private villa. I doted on my child, pouring all my energy into him. I would write letters to Calvin and send him pictures of the baby. After his hands healed, he had no lasting injuries. He painted every day and would occasionally send me drawings of small flowers and plants. His life, it seemed, wasn't entirely miserable. The people in Felix's life were constantly changing, but I didn't care about that at all anymore. Everyone who makes a mistake pays a price. I believed that. Soon enough, Felix's karma came for him. The next time I saw Felix was in the ICU. He had contracted a severe, unmentionable illness from one of his affairs and was on his deathbed. His parents asked me to see him one last time. Felix lay on the hospital bed, wearing an oxygen mask. His once vibrant face was ashen, and his body had wasted away to nothing but bone. He didn't seem to have the strength to even turn his head. His eyes just half open and slanted toward me. I saw a tear suddenly well up in the corner of his eye. He had lived a life without setbacks, only to end up in such a wretched state. His golden boy charm was gone, replaced by the foul smell of sickness. I didn't want you to see me like this. I don't feel sorry for you. You brought this on yourself. Will you go find him? Yes. Then you should go now. I'll wait. It won't be long anyway. We fell into silence. Felix seemed to gather a bit of strength and slowly turned his head to look at the ceiling. Do you remember the night we decided to be together? I remembered. It was a terrible party. He was probably feeling defiant, so he drank too much and passed out on a garden bench. His clothes a mess, a woman's lipstick smeared on his face. I had stepped out for some air and, worried he would get cold, I draped my jacket over him and waited by his side. The moonlight was beautiful. I looked at my future husband's face, and my heart hammered uncontrollably. A little while later, he woke up, blinked at me, and then smiled. He said the sound of my heartbeat was too loud, and then he fell asleep again, his head resting on me. I had been waiting for him, always waiting. I said calmly, I don't remember. Felix blinked slowly. The moon was so beautiful that night. I looked at you. The tips of your ears were red. So cute. I had already thought of names for our future children then. He reached a hand toward the ceiling. I followed his gaze. I didn't know what he was trying to grab, but his face was filled with bliss. Perhaps he had finally caught what he wanted most. A dream. It's just, I forgot them later. His hand fell back onto the bed. The heart monitor let out a long, flat beep. My eyes burned, and I quickly looked down. The door opened, and his family and nurses rushed in. I couldn't hear what they were saying. I just stared at the floor, dotted with water spots of various sizes. My wait was over. 2 weeks later, I boarded a plane with my child, heading to an orphanage in a small town in France. I didn't tell Calvin I was coming. When I arrived, he was still painting in an empty classroom. I pushed open the door and stepped into a world of color. I had been so nervous, afraid he would resent me, afraid that after so long apart, the feelings would have faded, leaving only awkwardness. But as I stood in the doorway, I saw the room was filled with portraits in all different styles. I recognized the curved lashes, the cupid's bow, the delicate nose, and the long neck of the person in the paintings. I also recognized the serene limbs, the canvas underneath the body, that sofa, and the vines and roots sprouting from the cracks in the fingertips. My child tugged on my hand. Daddy, is that you? Yes. Hundreds of paintings, all of me. The man hunched over in the corner heard my child's voice. He suddenly straightened up and turned his head. I saw that chiseled face, the thick, defined brows, and the eyes as blue-gray as a lake. I saw him smile. He stood up and ran to me, pulling me into his arms. His arms wrapped around my neck, and I could feel the excited but controlled tension in his muscles. I hugged him back. He had filled the years between us with those paintings. It felt as if I had just left the studio for a moment and come back to find nothing had changed. You're back. I'm back. Calvin felt the warmth on his shoulder, lifted his head, and cupped my tear-streaked face. He gently wiped away the tears with his thumb, his eyes full of tenderness. I laughed through my tears. You're stuck with this ugly crying face now. We kissed, and I melted in his arms. Our child frowned as he watched our passionate embrace. He covered his eyes, then turned to look out the window. Through the cracks between his fingers, he saw the warm sun, the new grass and fluttering birds, and the wind making flower petals dance in the air. Spring was here.